At 41 years old, Della Marsh had nothing left in the world but a carpetbag, a widow's cough she had inherited from a winter she should not have survived, and $11 folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Her uncle, Horace Pryor, who owned half the timber and all the pride in the town of Cottonwood Bend, Montana Territory, had cast her out the day the debts came due, saying a woman with no husband and no sons was a leak in a boat and he would not sink for her. So in the autumn of 1889, with the aspens turning the hills to hammered gold, she walked to the county auction and spent one single dollar on the thing no one else would touch, the abandoned railroad depot at Metcalf Siding, a gray plank building the trains had stopped visiting years before, its windows blind with dust, its platform sagging like a tired shoulder. Folks laughed. $1 for a dead depot at the end of a deadline seemed the last foolish act of a ruined woman. But sealed beneath that neglected floor, waiting through all the silent years, was something that would not only remake her life, but bring an entire forgotten valley back from the dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Marsh. And if you are watching tonight from a town the world has quietly given up on, a place that feels forgotten at the end of some deadline of your own, tell us in the comments where you are so we may keep you company a while. She had not always been alone, and she had not always been poor. Della was born in a sod-roofed cabin along the Musselshell, the only child of Jonah and Ruth Marsh, homesteaders who had come west with a wagon, a plow, and the stubborn belief that a person could make something out of a piece of ground nobody wanted if only they were willing to bleed for it. Her father was a quiet man with enormous hands and a surveyor's eye, a man who had once worked laying track for the railroad before he gave it up to farm, and who never lost his habit of reading the land the way other men read scripture. He taught Della to see the world in lines and measurements, to notice how water chose its path down a slope, how a ridge cast its shadow, how a fence post set true would stand a lifetime, while one set carelessly would heave itself out of the earth within a season. The land keeps its own books, Della girl, he used to say, tamping soil around a seedling with the flat of his thumb. It writes down every honest thing you do for it, and it pays you back with interest, though not always when you expect. Her mother taught her the other half of survival, the part that happened indoors. Ruth Marsh could make a meal out of nearly nothing, could stitch a torn coat so the seam disappeared, could nurse a fever through the worst of a night with cold claws and low singing. But more than any of that, she taught Della the discipline of noticing, of paying attention to small things others swept past. Most folks look, her mother would say, threading a needle by lamplight, but they don't see. And what they don't see, they leave behind. A clever woman lives on what other people leave behind. Those two lessons, her father's eye for lines and her mother's eye for the overlooked, braided themselves together in Della until she could not tell where one ended and the other began. And though she did not know it then, they were the whole inheritance she would ever truly need. The Winters took her parents within 2 years of each other, her mother first to the lung sickness and her father the following spring. Folks said to grief, though the death certificate blamed his heart. Della was 19 and suddenly the keeper of a small failing farm, and for a while she kept it going alone through sheer refusal to quit, plowing behind a borrowed mule, selling eggs and mended linens in town, reading the almanac by candle and planting exactly when her father would have planted. She married late at 30. A gentle railroad clerk named Amos Della had met when he came to survey the branch line, and for 11 years they had a modest, contented life in a rented house at the edge of Cottonwood Bend. They had no children who lived. 2 came and neither stayed past their first hard winter, and Della carried those small griefs folded away inside her the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint. Amos died of a fall from a trestle in the spring of 1888, and the railroad paid her a small settlement that her uncle Horace, appointed by the court as the administrator of Amos's meager estate, promptly invested, or so he claimed, in ventures that somehow always lost money. What Della had, when she added it all up in the ledger she kept in her head, was this: no husband, no child, no parents, no land of her own, and an uncle who regarded her as a debt to be discharged. But she also had a pair of eyes trained since girlhood to see what others missed, a spine that had never once bent all the way to the ground, and the memory of a father's voice telling her that the land keeps its own books, She did not yet know how much that inheritance was worth. She was about to find out. The ruin came the way ruin usually comes, not all at once, but in a slow closing of doors. After Amos died, Horace Pryor moved Della into a lean-to behind his own grand house on the pretext of caring for his poor widowed niece, and for a year she earned her keep as an unpaid servant, cooking and scrubbing and mending for his household while he told the town what a burden she was and how good he was to shoulder it. She saw the accounts he thought she could not read. She saw how Amos's settlement money, which should have kept her modestly for the rest of her life, had been folded into Horace's timber speculations and vanished behind columns of figures no honest ledger would recognize. When she confronted him quietly in the privacy of his study, holding a page she had copied out in her own careful hand, he did not shout. He simply smiled the smile of a man who holds all the cards and told her that the money was gone, that she had no proof of anything, and that a grateful woman would be wise to hold her tongue and keep her cot. She did not hold her tongue. That was perhaps her only mistake, if speaking the truth can be counted a mistake. She went to the county clerk and asked, plainly and in front of witnesses, whether an administrator was permitted to spend a widow's settlement on his own private ventures. The clerk went pale, and word traveled fast in a town the size of Cottonwood Bend, and by nightfall, Horace Pryor had decided that Della Marsh was no longer a burden he could afford to shoulder. He told her, in front of his wife and his two grown sons, that she had insulted the family that fed her, that she was ungrateful and unwell in her mind besides, and that she would be gone from his property by morning. He put $11 on the kitchen table, the last of what he claimed remained of anything owed to her, and he said it was more than she deserved. Then he went to bed, and Della sat alone in the cold lean-to and did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had learned to do without. She spent that night the way her mother had taught her, taking careful stock. $11 would buy a stagecoach seat to Helena and a week's boarding, after which she would be exactly as poor but farther from anyone who knew her name. Or it would buy a few sacks of flour and a great deal of hunger. And here her father's voice came into her, quiet and sure it would buy her a foothold, some small overlooked thing nobody wanted, from which a patient person might build. In the morning, she took her carpetbag and walked to the county courthouse, where a notice tacked to the board announced an auction of tax-forfeited and railroad abandoned properties. The sad leftovers of a branch line the Northern Pacific had surveyed, half-built, and then abandoned when the copper strikes drew the money elsewhere. Among the parcels was a single entry that made her stop and read it twice. One railroad depot, structure only, at Meltwater Siding, known locally as Meltcalf, in the Cinnabar Valley. Minimum bid $1, no reserve, sold as is, where is. The Cinnabar Valley. She knew the name. It was the very valley her father had helped survey decades before, when the railroad first dreamed of running track up through the mountains to reach the mines that never quite came in. She remembered him speaking of it, of a beautiful lonesome basin with a creek running silver through it and a scatter of miners' cabins that emptied out when the ore ran thin. The depot at Meltcalf Siding had been built in a burst of optimism to serve a town that never fully arrived, and when the line was abandoned, the depot was simply left to the weather, too far from anywhere to be worth tearing down. The auctioneer, a bored man in a checked vest, could hardly keep the laughter out of his voice when he read the lot aloud, and when Della raised her hand and said, clearly, $1, there was no second bid. There was only the sound of a few men chuckling, and someone muttering that the poor Marsh woman had finally lost what little sense the good Lord gave her. She paid her $1. She took the deed, ink still wet, and she folded it into her carpetbag beside the $10 she had left, and she began the long walk toward the Cinnabar Valley, toward a dead depot at the end of a dead line, because it was, in all the world, the only thing that was hers. It took her the better part of 2 days to reach Meltcalf Siding on foot, following the ghost of the abandoned railbed where the ties had rotted and the rails had long since been pried up and carried off for scrap. She came over the last rise at dusk on the second day, and there it stood in the failing light, smaller and more forlorn than she had imagined, a single-story depot of gray weathered planks with a low platform running along the trackless bed, its once red paint peeled to the color of old ash, its windows filmed and cracked, a wooden sign above the door on which the letters Meltcalf could still just be read beneath the streaks of 40 rains. Behind it, the Cinnabar Valley opened out exactly as her father had described, a long green basin cradled by dark timbered ridges, a creek stitching its silver thread down the middle, and here and there among the aspens, the sagging shapes of abandoned cabins, 7 or 8 of them, their chimneys cold, their doors hanging open on the emptiness within. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen, and it was hers. And standing there in the last of the light, Delamarche felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not despair, but a strange, steadying calm, as though she had come home to a house she had never lived in. The door was swollen shut, and she had to put her shoulder to it, and inside the air was thick with dust and the small, dry rustle of mice. There was a ticket window with its little iron grill, a potbelly stove gone orange with rust, a battered desk, and along one wall a bench where travelers who never came had once been meant to wait. She swept the place clear, spread her one blanket, and made a small fire of broken slats in the stove, and she ate the last of her bread, and she slept the sleep of a woman with no farther to fall. In the morning, in the honest gray light, she began to do the thing she always did, the thing her mother had taught her. She began to notice. She swept and she scrubbed and she cataloged, and it was while she was down on her knees prying up a warped floorboard near the stove, meaning to replace it before someone turned an ankle, that she found the first clue. Beneath the board, wedged into the dark space between the joists and wrapped in a square of oiled canvas, gone brittle with age, was a flat tin box, the kind that once held tea, and inside the box, folded in quarters and preserved by the dry mountain air, was a hand-drawn map. She carried it to the window and unfolded it with the care of a woman handling something newly hatched. It was drawn in a fine, deliberate hand in ink that had faded to the brown of dried creek water, and it showed the Cinnabar Valley in careful survey lines she recognized at once, because they were drawn in a style she had learned to read at her own father's knee, the same clean way of marking elevation, the same particular flourish on the compass rose. At the center of the map was the depot, marked with a small square, and the words Meltcalf Siding. From the depot, a dotted line ran up along the creek to a spot marked with a tiny drawing of a cabin and the notation First Cross Sill. And from that first cabin, another dotted line ran farther up the slope to a second cabin, and a third line beyond that, though the third destination had been left curiously blank, marked only with a small inked circle and a single word Della could not at first make out until she tilted the paper to the light and read it. Faith. There was no name signed to the map, no date, nothing to say who had drawn it or why, only those dotted lines linking the dead depot to a first cabin, a second, and a third, and that one strange final word waiting at the end of the trail like a held breath. Now, a foolish woman, or a greedy one, might have run up the valley that same hour, tearing at floorboards and clawing at hearthstones in search of buried gold, for the mountains of Montana were full of such stories, and fuller still of the bones of men who had chased them. But Delamarche had been raised by a man who read the land like scripture and a woman who lived on what others left behind, and she understood at once that this map was not a treasure map in the ordinary sense. It was too careful, too gentle. The word at the end of it was not gold or silver or ore, it was faith, so she did not run. She studied the map for 3 full days, comparing its lines to the valley she could see from her platform, and she mended her depot and set her snares and gathered rose hips and the last of the autumn greens so that she would not starve while she thought, and only when she was certain she understood the map's language did she take up a walking stick and follow the first dotted line up along the Silver Creek to the cabin marked First Cross Sill. It was one of the sagging abandoned cabins she had seen from the depot, a small square of squared logs half swallowed by wild rose, its roof caved at one corner, its door long gone. Inside, the floor was earth and the single window a hole, and it seemed at first no different from any of the other dead cabins in the valley. But the map had told her to look at the cross sill, the great square timber laid across the top of the doorway, and when she stood beneath it and looked up, she saw that someone had carved into the underside of that sill, in letters an inch deep and worn soft by years, a verse and a name. The verse she recognized. It was from the Psalms, the one about the stone the builders rejected. And the name carved beneath it, plain and deep, was Elias Marsh. Della stood in the doorway of that ruined cabin with her hand pressed to her mouth, because Elias Marsh was her father's elder brother, the uncle she had never met, the one the family never spoke of, the one who had gone west into the mountains before she was born and never come home, and whose name Horace Pryor had struck so thoroughly from the family that Della had grown up believing he was only a rumor, a story, a man who might never have existed at all. She sat down on the earthen floor of her lost uncle's cabin, and she let the cold facts arrange themselves. Her father Jonah, her uncle Horace, and this third brother Elias, three sons of the same hard family, and only two of them ever spoken of. She remembered now the fragments she had overheard as a child, the way her grandmother's voice would drop, the way Horace's face would close like a fist whenever the eldest brother's name came near the surface of a conversation. She had always assumed Elias had died young or disgraced the family somehow, but here was his name carved with the loving care of a man marking a thing meant to last, above the door of a cabin in a valley her own father had surveyed, at the top of a trail that began beneath the floor of a depot no one had wanted. And the trail did not end here. The map ran on from this first cabin to a second, farther up the slope, and she rose, and she brushed the earth from her skirts, and she followed it. The second cabin was harder to reach, set back in a stand of dark pines where the creek narrowed to a rushing chute, and it was in far better repair than the first, as though someone had cared for it longer or built it stronger. Its door was a real door, hung on leather, hinges gone stiff but whole, and inside, out of the weather, the air was dry and still, and smelled faintly of old wood smoke and something else, something like paper. Here the map had marked no cross-sill but a hearth, and Della knelt at the cold stone fireplace and ran her fingers along the mortar until she found, just as she had begun to hope she would, one flat stone set slightly proud of the others, its edges worn smooth by a hand that had lifted it many times. She worked it loose, and behind it, in a cavity lined with tin to keep out the damp, she found not gold but a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon and a leather-bound ledger, and beneath those a small canvas sack that clinked softly when she lifted it into the light. The papers were letters and documents, and Della read them by the light of the doorway all through that long afternoon, and slowly the true shape of the secret rose up before her, like a valley emerging from morning fog. Elias Marsh had come west as a young man and struck a modest but genuine vein of silver in the Cinnabar Valley, enough to make him comfortable but not enough to draw the attention of the great mining concerns. Rather than tearing the valley apart for it, he had worked it quietly and carefully, and he had done something that the letters made unmistakable. He had used his silver to bring in a scatter of hard-luck families, widows and orphans and men broken by other men's mines, and he had settled them in the cabins along the creek and taught them to farm the good bottomland and to work the vein in small, honest measure, sharing it out fairly, so that the Cinnabar Valley became, for a brief and shining decade, a kind of refuge, a place where the people the world had thrown away could begin again. The ledger recorded it all in his fine, deliberate hand, every family, every share, every dollar, kept as scrupulously as a man keeps accounts he expects God to audit. And the letters told, too, of how it ended, for in his last years Elias had fallen ill, and he had written to his two younger brothers back east, to Jonah and to Horace, asking them to come and help him keep the valley alive and hold it in trust for the families who, depended on it. Jonah, her father, had written back that he would come as soon as the spring planting allowed, but the sickness took Jonah first, and he never made the journey. Horace, however, had come, and here the letters grew dark, for the last of them was in a different hand, a lawyer's hand, and it recorded that upon Elias Marsh's death, his brother Horace Pryor, as his only reachable kin, had claimed the valley, dissolved the little community, driven off the families with threats and false debts, exactly as he would one day drive off Della herself, and then, finding the silver vein all but played out and the land too remote to sell, had simply abandoned the whole valley and let the world forget it existed. What Horace had never known, because Elias had been too wise to trust him with it, was that the old man had not left his true accounting in the cabin where he died. He had hidden it, and the modest remainder of his fortune with it, along a trail of his own devising, marked on a map sealed beneath the floor of the depot, to be found only by someone with the patience to look and the eyes to see someone. Elias had written in the last letter of all, "Of my own blood, who values what others discard, for to such a one, and no other, I leave the keeping of this place." The little canvas sack held 40 gold double eagles, $800, more money than Della had held in her hands in all her life, and the map ran on, still past the second cabin, to a third, to the place marked only faith Word of what a person does in a lonely valley has a way of traveling farther than the valley itself. And Della had been seen on the road, and her purchase of the depot had been the joke of the county for a week. And it did not take long for the news of her strange industry to reach the ears of Horace Pryor in Cottonwood Bend. At first, he only laughed, as everyone laughed, at the notion of his cast off niece playing house in a dead depot at the end of a deadline. But Horace Pryor had a memory, and a guilty man's memory is a restless thing. And the more he thought about the Cinnabar Valley and his half remembered brother and the loose ends he had left there decades before, the less he laughed. He remembered that he had never actually held clear title to the valley itself, only seized it by intimidation. And he remembered that his brother Elias had died with his affairs unaccountably tidy for a dying man. And it began to gnaw at him that there might be something in that valley he had overlooked, some money, some proof, some thread that pulled might unravel the respectable life he had built on the backs of the people he had wronged. So he did what men like Horace always do. He decided that whatever might be found in the Cinnabar Valley belonged to him, and he sent his two grown sons up the abandoned railed with a wagon and a lawyer's letter to inform the foolish widow that the depot might be hers on paper, but the land it sat upon and the whole valley beyond it were prior land, and that she was trespassing, and that she had until the turning of the month to be gone. They found her on the platform of her depot, and she listened to them, read their letter without a word, and when they had finished, she asked them quietly whether their father had ever told them they had a great uncle named Elias. The younger son laughed and the elder son frowned, and neither of them knew the name, and Della saw in their blank faces exactly how thoroughly Horace had buried his brother. She did not show them the ledger, she did not show them the letters or the gold or the map. She only told them, in a voice as level as her father's had ever been, that she had bought the depot lawfully for $1 at a county auction, that the surrounding land had been abandoned and its taxes unpaid for decades and belonged to no man living, and that if their father wished to press a claim, he was welcome to bring his proof of title before the county court, where such matters were decided in the open, in front of witnesses, by the reading of honest ledgers. At the word ledger, something must have crossed her face, some flicker of her father's certainty, because the elder son studied her with sudden unease, and the two of them climbed back into their wagon and rattled away down the dead rail bed. And Della knew that they would tell Horace what she had said, and that the word ledger would land in his ear like a coal dropped into dry grass. He came himself 4 days later, alone, on a lathered horse, an old man now with silver at his temples and a fine coat gone dusty from the ride, and he did not bother with lawyers or letters. He found Della at the second cabin, where she had gone to sit with her uncle's papers, and he stood in the doorway blocking the light, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he saw the ledger open on her lap, and the leather bindings and the faded ribbon, and the color went out of his face, because a guilty man always knows the shape of the thing that will condemn him even before he can read a word of it. He tried first the old way. He told her she was a poor, confused woman meddling in matters beyond her, that the papers were worthless, that the valley was cursed and empty, and she should take whatever coin she had found and go and be grateful. When that did not move her, he tried threats, reminding her that he was a man of standing and she a woman of none, that a word from him in the right ear could have her committed to the asylum in Warm Springs as a lunatic, that no court would take the word of a ruined widow over a respected man. And when that did not move her either, when Della simply looked at him with her father's steady eyes and said, "You came here once before, Horace, and drove out everyone your brother gathered. I have their names. I have his accounting. I know what you did." The old man's threats collapsed into something worse and more honest, which was fear. But Delamarche had not spent 3 days studying a map only to squander what it taught her, and what the map had taught her in the end was not where money was hidden, but what a person was meant to do with what they found. She did not threaten Horace back. She did not run to the sheriff with the ledger, though she could have, nor did she take the 800 gold dollars and vanish into a comfortable anonymous life in some far city, though she could have done that too, and no one would ever have blamed her. Instead, on the following morning, she left Horace to stew in the fear of what she might do, and she followed the last dotted line on the map, up past the second cabin, up the steepening slope through the dark pines to the place marked only with a circle and the word faith. And there she found the third cabin, the smallest and the highest and the soundest of them all, built with special care against the mountain's shoulder, And inside it she found not gold and not silver, but the true treasure her uncle Elias had hidden at the end of his trail, a strong box containing the original deed to the entire Cinnabar Valley, 3,200 acres, filed and recorded and paid in full in Elias Marsh's name, together with a will, witnessed and sealed and legally unbreakable, leaving the whole of it in trust to whichever of his blood should find their way to the end of his map, on the single binding condition that the valley be used forever as a refuge and a homestead for those the world had cast aside, exactly as he had first intended. She carried it all down the mountain, the deed and the will and the ledger and the letters and the gold, and she did not go to Horace, and she did not go to Hyde. She went to the county courthouse in Cottonwood Bend, the very place where she had once bought a dead depot for $1 while men laughed, and she laid the whole of it before the county judge in the open light of the courtroom, every document read aloud in front of witnesses exactly as an honest ledger should be read. The will was found sound and the deed unassailable. And in a single afternoon, Della Marsh, who 3 weeks before had owned nothing in the world but $11 and a carpetbag, was confirmed the lawful trustee of 3,200 acres of the Cinnabar Valley. And in that same courtroom, entered into the record alongside her uncle's will, was Elias Marsh's accounting of what had befallen the families of the valley and who had driven them out. And the judge, reading it, turned his eyes upon Horace Pryor, where he sat gray-faced at the back of the room. And the questions began that day that would in time strip Horace of the timber and the standing and the good name he had built on stolen ground, not through any vengeance of Della's, but through the plain, slow weight of the truth written down and finally read aloud. Della took no gold for herself beyond what she needed to buy tools and seed and lumber. She used Elias's 40 double eagles and the authority of his will to send word out along every rail line and down every rutted road to the poorhouses and the orphan asylums and the mining camps where broken men coughed out their last wages, that there was a valley in the mountains where a person with nothing could come and be given honest land and honest work and a fair share, asking only that they honor the same in turn. They came slowly at first, a widow and her children, an old prospector with ruined lungs, 2 orphan brothers who had been sleeping in a livery stable, and then more, until by the following summer, the cold chimneys of the Cinnabar Valley smoked again, and the caved roofs were mended, and children ran shouting through bottomland that had lain silent for 30 years, and the little vein of silver was worked once more in small, honest measure, shared out fairly, and recorded in a new ledger kept in Della's own careful hand. And she reopened the depot, too, and petitioned the railroad. And in time for a valley that ships silver and grain as a valley, the railroad remembers a spur line was laid once more up the Cinnabar, and the trains came back to Melcalf Siding, and the little gray depot that a ruined woman had bought for a single dollar became again what it had been built to be, the beating heart of a living place, the door through which the forgotten came home. Remember how we told you that at 41 years old, Della Marsh had nothing left in the world but a carpetbag, a widow's cough, and 11 soft-creased dollars, and that her uncle had cast her out saying a woman alone was a leak in a boat. Remember how the whole county laughed when she spent one single dollar on a dead depot at the end of a deadline and called it the last foolish act of a ruined woman. It was not foolishness. It was the thing her father had taught her when she was small, tamping soil around a seedling with the flat of his thumb, that the land keeps its own books and writes down every honest thing you do and pays it back with interest, though not always when you expect. And it was the thing her mother had taught her by lamplight that most folks look but do not see, and that a clever woman lives on what others leave behind. Della Marsh had lived her whole life on what others discarded. And so, when the world discarded her, she alone had the eyes to recognize her own true worth. Sealed beneath a forgotten floor, she had bought a dead depot and found a map, and followed it to a first cabin, and a second, and a third. And at the end of it, she had found not a fortune to keep, but a purpose to give away. And in giving it away, she had restored a whole valley of the forgotten to life, and become, at last, exactly what her uncle Elias had prayed. His heir would be one who values what others discard. Thank you for sitting with us tonight here at the end of the long deadline where the trains have started running again. If Della's story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and that the thing the builders reject is so often the very cornerstone We would love to hear from you before you go, so let us leave you with one gentle question to carry into your week. When was a time in your own life that you found real value in something or someone that others had written off and left behind? Tell us in the comments, for those stories are the truest treasure this old channel keeps. Rest now, wherever you are, whatever deadline you may be standing at the end of, and know that value has a patient way of waiting to be found. Until next time, stay close.